This is Join Us in France, episode 367, 367. Bonjour, I'm Annie Sargent, and Join Us in France is the podcast where we talk about France. Great places to visit in France, French culture, history, gastronomy, and news related to travel during the pandemic. Today, I bring you a conversation with Dr. Suzanne Levin, and you'll see her extraordinary ability to explain a dark moment in the French Revolution, the Terror. Many of us are totally baffled by what happened in 1793 and 1794, but Dr. Levin shines the right kind of light on this whole thing, and I think you're going to enjoy this episode. The French expression of the week is going to be « Il pédale dans la semoule ». This is a fun one. I'll explain in a bit. The State Department has raised the level for travel to France to level 4, which is do not travel. I'll talk about that after my chat with Suzanne. If you like what we do here at Join Us in France, consider supporting us by visiting joinusinfrance.com/boutique to check out my cookbook, Join Us at the Table, my Paris tours on the Voice Map app, and my very popular itinerary review service where I help you craft the best vacation in France specifically for you. You'll be able to purchase your own itinerary planning service after December 26. Follow Addicted to France on Instagram to see the photos I took on the top floor of the Carnavalet Museum in Paris, which is all about the French Revolution. The best way to stay in touch with me and with the podcast is to sign up for the newsletter at joinusinfrance.com/newsletter. Bonjour, Suzanne, and welcome to Join Us in France.
Bonjour. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
So welcome back, I should have said, because you were on the show last week where you told us you brought us all the way to the Terror. So you really explained it very well, and I'm hoping that you can help me untangle the Terror in my head, because that is where it gets really complicated. And, you know, to a layperson like me, it sounds like, why would they do that? Like, it makes no sense. They killed their friends. They killed one another. Mm-hmm. It's like they kept accusing one another of treason. But there was no really, anyway, please explain what happened.
So here's the thing that it's important to understand about this period. A lot of people want to ask the question, okay, where does the Terror come from? And in my view, that's kind of a bad question to ask for two reasons. I mean, not that it makes, people who ask it bad in and of themselves, of course, but I think it's kind of taking things from the wrong perspective for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Terror as such, I'm gonna blow your mind here, but it doesn't really exist any more than the Middle Ages. Any more than the Middle Ages exists.
Okay.
This is yeah. So this is a term that is applied afterwards in very specific circumstances, which I'd like to talk about in a little bit, to a period to kind of make it appear to be a coherent whole in a way that it really wasn't at the time. So essentially, it's not particularly unusual to have a situation of repression that is associated with war and crisis. This is something that we see in basically every war, that there's some kind of repression, that there's censorship, that people are imprisoned for being on the side of at least looking like they're on the side of the enemy, whether or not they actually are, etc. And so this is something that is not particularly unusual either in the time period we're looking at or throughout history generally. So the question then becomes, why is this particular period of war viewed only in the context of repression, and the war is kind of an afterthought, despite the fact that this is a war for the very survival of this country and of this new republic, and a war that is opposing one country to basically all of Europe and some of its own citizens in zones of civil war. And we're not talking about, imaginary. There's a certain historiography that kind of treats this as if all of this is in the minds of the revolutionaries, that nobody is really opposing them and they're just kind of projecting in a way. And it's kind of amazing to me that anyone could think that, considering the context that we're looking at. Nobody would ever look at, say, the repression from World War I, where you actually start seeing the first concentration camps, which, just to be clear, are different than like the Nazi death camps. That those are often used as synonyms, but they're not. But this idea that you're putting people in camps, this idea that you're having major press censorship, this idea that you're shooting deserters, etc. Nobody looks at that and is like, well, where does that repression come from without the context of the war? The war is the main subject, and then the repression is explained by the war. It's really only in the case of the French Revolution that this is viewed as completely disconnected. Now, that does not mean that everything is explained by, there's a war on, so of course they did X, Y, and Z. No, in my view, the question is not why was there repression at all in the first place. That's pretty standard, and it would actually be more surprising if there weren't any. The question is, why did it take the form that it did, right? And in some ways, that form is you might say worse or better than in other situations, for lack of a better term. Worse in the sense that you have all of these high-profile cases of people who are being executed, but also in the sense that most repression, and this is part of the reason why we remember this period in particular. Most of the victims of repression are anonymous. They're the anonymous masses. No one knows who they are. They aren't rich and powerful. You don't have their life story. If they survive, they don't go on to write bestsellers about their experience. They don't have the cultural capital to do that. They might not even know how to write, etc. And so I think the first reason that we believe that we remember this period in this way as like this absolute horror is the people who are the victims of the repression. So for once, we're dealing with repression of high-profile people, members of the government, the king and queen, which, contrary to popular belief, they were not executed at the same time or for the same reasons. So this is not a matter of they're royals, so off with their heads. It's a little bit more complicated than that. But in any case, the idea is that you have all these high profile victims, whether they're initially counter-revolutionaries or whether, as you say, they're revolutionaries who are turned on by their colleagues, which, obviously that goes both ways. And certainly in the case of the Montagnard versus Brissotin, if the Brissotin had won, it's fairly clear, judging by their rhetoric, that they would have done similar to their adversaries. I do want to acknowledge here that this comes from a starting place of reality. You really do have a number of high-profile cases of treason. You have generals that try to march their armies against Paris, Lafayette included, and also after him. And you have generals taking the lead in provincial revolts that are led by Brissotin deputies after they're expelled from the convention. And I guess I should back up a little bit and talk about that, because that's often viewed as just like, it's a purge of undesirables or whatever by the government. And that's not at all what happened. This is not a coup d'etat. It's a popular insurrection giving basically the demand for the recall of certain deputies who are believed to have betrayed their electoral mandate. And it's important to recall in this context that we're not dealing with a system where they have something set up already. They're in the process of writing a constitution, but a lot of people believe, and this is still, a fairly common and I think legitimate belief that people can hold, that, once you elect your representative, that doesn't mean that they now have the power to do whatever they want, that, electors should have the power to recall their elected officials. And it's something, exists in a number of places, including in the United States. And so that's basically what they're trying to do. They're attempting to exercise this power in kind of a situation of urgency because the Constitution isn't finished, but they feel that these deputies have betrayed their mandate and are blocking legislation. And the idea was absolutely not to imprison these deputies and execute them to begin with. But what basically happened is a lot of them went into the provinces and joined uprisings against the rest of the convention, which is so that's really where we're getting into more like expansion of the Civil War, where it started with resistance to military service. And now we also have kind of the provincial bourgeoisie who are rising up as well. And then from the perspective of the convention, that's, yet another problem that needs to be dealt with. It's too late for negotiation because we're into armed revolt here. And so at this point, there's repression of these uprisings, and that repression is more or less extreme, basically depending on how extreme the uprising was. There are places like Lyon where they basically had to besiege them for months in order to reintegrate Lyon into the Republic. And there are other regions where the uprising basically just fizzled out. Because in a lot of places there was no popular basis for it. It was just kind of led by local administrators. And so in those cases, there was a lot less repression. It was more, okay, you made a mistake, but it's fine. We might take what we would call kind of security measures against you, but we're not going to consider that you're counter-revolutionaries. We're not going to have you executed or any of that. And so you have really the situation again where you're continuing to deal with the foreign war, which throughout most of 1793. 1794, France is losing, and part of French territory is actually occupied. And of course, to make the stakes very clear, in the parts of French territory that are occupied, they have completely done away with all revolutionary reforms, restored the Ancien Régime, and also mercilessly repressed any revolutionaries that remained in the territory. And so you basically have repression and violence on multiple different sides, and also in multiple different countries going on, because the French Revolution, we think about it sometimes as this isolated thing, but it's actually part of a larger phenomenon that we sometimes call an age of revolutions that goes from mid-century revolutions in Geneva and Corsica through the American Revolution, through more revolutions that are happening at the same time as the French Revolution, and all the way to Latin American independences going into the 1820s. So you have this much broader, and of course the Haitian Revolution, which also starts in the French colony of what is then Saint-Domingue and will become Haiti, and so that's starting in this period as well. So it is very complex, and I wouldn't blame people at all for feeling a little bit lost. I guess what kind of gets to me a little bit about that sometimes is people are like, well, it's complicated and therefore it's chaos and therefore it's bad. And so there are definitely things that are negative about this period. Don't get me wrong. That is something that I do want to get into a little bit more in just a minute. But we're also dealing with a period where you finally get things like the definitive abolition of feudal dues. You get things like major reforms in inheritance law, major reforms in education, major reforms in terms of not so much women's political rights, although women have been participating in the revolution this whole time, but in terms of you have basically no-fault divorce in 1792. That's something that Bonaparte is going to get rid of later on, and it won't come back until the 1970s. So you have things that are really ahead of their time. You have the recognition of quote-unquote illegitimate children. You have the principle of free, universal, obligatory primary school. You have all of these things that are coming in. And of course, the big one is the first abolition of slavery, right? Which again is something that Bonaparte is going to, and then it's going to have to be abolished again in 1848. But you do have a lot of positive things that are coming out of this period. You have this massive amount of democratic experimentation as well. And so that's kind of the paradox of the period. It's both the height of the repression and the height of the democratic movement, the height of all of these reforms, many of which we might consider ahead of their time, and some of which are also very long lasting, like even the Restoration government. That's when Louis XVI's brothers come back to power after the Empire. Even they never dared to restore feudal dues. Like that was just not something that was within their power. They would have been kicked out right away if they had attempted that. And so it's not just a matter of who's in charge either. There are some lasting reforms in that vein. But regardless, to get back to the question of, the terror, what is it? And, where does it come from? Yeah. I kind of, in terms of, I think I've kind of gone over like where repression in general comes from. But in terms of, why specifically a lot of the victims of that repression ended up not being people who said openly, I'm for the monarchy, I'm for the return of the Ancien Regime, what we think of as counter-revolutionaries as historians, and why a number of those people ended up being people who, if you ask them, would say, I'm absolutely for the revolution, I'm a good Republican. It's actually the people who are in power now who aren't good Republicans. They're the real counter-revolutionaries. And basically this can be explained by, in large part, as I said, these repeated instances of treason you have that keep being discovered kind of after the fact. So you have a very popular revolutionary early on, Mirabeau, who was actually put into he died in 1791, probably of natural causes, although there were at the time. Anyway,
he was young, right? He was like 40 or something. He was pretty young, yeah.
Yeah. So, but, apparently he had liver trouble. So, it can, before antibiotics, that's the sort of thing that can take you off pretty quickly. But in any case, so he was put in the new Pantheon, which was the church it was re-inaugurated as the Pantheon under the Third Republic. You could still see it there. And the idea is that they are going to illustrious men by burying them there. And now, of course, it's illustrious women as well. But at the time, that was kind of the notion. And so he was actually buried in the Pantheon, or entombed, I guess would be more of the term. There's no dirt down there, but in any case, so
good point.
Then they found out, he was actually being paid off by the court to conspire against the revolution, and maybe we don't want to be honoring this guy. And that's just one example among many. I already talked about some generals in that case. So they remove him from the Pantheon, and they're kind of understandably on edge in a situation where it's not really possible once you get into a situation where you're at war with all of Europe and part of France over, whether the Republic is going to survive or not. It's not really possible at that point to openly proclaim yourself a royalist without having the whole repressive apparatus fall immediately on you. And so there's understandably and kind of ironically a fear of secret royalists that comes out of this, because of course nobody's going to say that they're a royalist, right?
Of course.
And then you also have, these very real cases that are documented of people being in the pay of foreign courts, trying to corrupt the revolution from within. And so I think really that's largely where this idea comes from, that, you have conspiracies against the revolution because some of them are very real. And the question is, where do you draw the line? Because conspiracies are, notoriously difficult to pin down, even for historians. Yeah. It's very hard for us to know even to what extent any of these fears were founded. Sometimes we have very strong evidence, sometimes we don't, but even in cases where we don't, absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. So you can see where contemporaries in particular would have been very unable to distinguish. And so I think really that's where this is coming from. And it's important to note at the same time that this idea of like a culture of conspiracy, both as a real way of participating in politics and as something that people are afraid of, is something that is kind of inherited from the Ancien Regime. Because remember that I mentioned last time that under the Ancien Regime, politics is really not something that you're allowed to participate as a member of the public. You're not allowed to participate in it. It's the king's private thing. So to the extent that anything happens politically, there's a lot of court intrigue going on. There is a lot going on behind the scenes that you can only guess at as a member of the public. And I mean, I think that's a culture that really continues on into the revolution. And it's not only the revolutionaries who are a little bit paranoid about conspiracies. You get these theories coming out of the counter-revolution that the revolution itself is the result of a conspiracy. And that's where you get these ideas about, it was the Freemasons, all of this.
Okay.
So you have this kind of broader culture of fear of conspiracy. You have very real conspiracies, and then you have at the same time this notion of we need to remain a united front of Republicans against this onslaught of monarchical counter-revolution, both in the terms of these foreign armies and foreign courts, and in the sense that we're dealing with civil war. And given that, I think it was very easy for people at a certain point. You have notably the fall of the factions in the beginning of 1794. So this is year 2 now of the Republican calendar that they've adopted in the meantime, which I would love to get into as well, but I'm sure that time is limited. In any case, so you have these factions that basically, on the one hand, you have the indulgence around Danton, sometimes called the Dantonists because of that. And their idea is basically we need to put an end to all repressive measures and we need to make peace immediately with all of our neighbors. And this is the sort of thing that sounds really good on paper, in practice would have been a lot more complicated. First of all, in the case of making peace, France was very much not winning the war at this point. So you have to ask the question of what kinds of concessions would these powers have demanded of revolutionary France. And that's, where it gets a little bit dicey. But so you have the indulgence on the one hand, and then you have the ultras or the Hébertistes around the journalist Hébert on the other hand saying, no, we need to go further with all these repressive measures. We need to go further as well with the influence of the democratic sections of Paris in particular, because basically larger cities were divided into sections, but every town in France, even the smallest village had its primary assembly, which was basically a forum for any citizen to discuss politics, to petition the convention, to try to influence both local and national politics. And there were some saying, we're in the middle of a war, we need to limit that influence to some extent, at least temporarily. And others saying, we're trying to found a democratic republic, so we want to extend it. And at the same time, they're saying this, but they're also saying, we need to crack down even more on counter-revolutionaries, on aristocrats, which, of course, in this period is not just a synonym for nobles. It's basically anybody who supports the counter-revolution, whether they're noble or not, can be referred to as an aristocrat. And so basically what happened was that the convention, and notably the convention, basically I should maybe back up a little bit and say that one of the very unique things about this period is that not so much that there's repression, but that the repression and indeed every other aspect of politics is being led by the legislature. They're not giving up power to the executive. There's no president or king or there is an executive council, but it's kept strictly subordinate to the legislature in keeping with the principles that the revolutionaries held to, which was that, the law is the voice of the people. It's the expression of popular sovereignty, whereas the executive should not be making independent decisions. It just exists to execute that decision. So we're not seeing military power. We're not seeing an increase in the prerogatives of the executive, which is exactly the opposite of what you see in every other period of war and crisis, at least every other one that I can think of. And this is not a new point. By the way, this is a point that the historian Albert Mathieu had already made, during World War I, comparing how the repression during World War I happened versus the French Revolution. But in any case, the convention basically said, okay, so we need these extraordinary measures, but there's still extraordinary measures that to some degree should follow revolutionary principles. So, for example, they establish a revolutionary tribunal, but the revolutionary tribunal does not copy the model of the Ancien Regime, where justice is secret and you can't have a defender and there's no jury and etc. So they have a jury and there's a defense and there are all of these things.
Yeah.
So it's an extraordinary jurisdiction, to be sure, but they are not just, throwing all of their principles out the window while they're doing this. They're trying to reconcile, okay, so there are some things that we need to compromise on a little bit given the crisis situation, but there are some things we want to hold on to. And so one of those things was, again, the power of the of the legislature over the other branches of government, and notably over the military as well. And so one of the things that they do is they create an institution called the Representatives on Mission. So basically what they do is they send deputies from the convention out into the provinces or to the armies to make sure that the law is being executed, to keep the generals on their toes, to ensure that the administrators are not revolting again. And so that's one thing that they do. And another thing that they do is give extraordinary powers to certain legislative committees, the most famous of which are the Comité de Salut Public, which is often, or today, always translated as the Committee of Public Safety, even though it's more like the Committee of Public Salvation would be a more accurate descriptor, and then the Comité de Sûreté Générale, which is generally translated as the Committee of General Security, and that would actually be better translated as the Committee of General Safety. But in any case, the point is that the Committee of General Security deals with all of the directly repressive measures. So everything dealing with arrests, everything dealing with sending people before the Revolutionary Tribunal, and so on. And the Committee of Public Safety deals with more general issues, and notably issues related to the defense. And these two committees work together on a number of high-profile cases, including, again, when we get into the factions that spring up at the end of 1793 that I already mentioned, the Dantonists and the Hébertists, or the Indulgents and the Ultras, however you prefer to call them. But in any case, the revolutionary government at this point says, both of these factions are equally harmful, and so we really need to strike at both of them in order to get back on track toward winning this war and ultimately founding the republic that we all want. And so they arrest the major leaders of these factions, and some of the least fair and principled trials of the revolution. They basically use the Revolutionary Tribunal to have them executed.
Right.
And it's important to note, as Marissa Linton has done, that the Revolutionary Tribunal basically functioned kind of à deux vitesses. There were two different levels. If you were a high-profile politician going before the Revolutionary Tribunal, at least after Marat, who was acquitted by it early on, but that's really another context. It's basically a death sentence. But if you're most people, you actually have a better than average chance of being acquitted, at least up until the law of Prairial, which I'll get to in a minute. And so basically, from my perspective as a historian, it's not really I don't really see it as my role to hand out judgments. These historical figures are good and these historical figures are bad. That said, I definitely view the fall of the factions as one of the bigger mistakes that the revolutionaries made. I think that it almost certainly only made things worse, both from a moral perspective and the perspective of posterity, and from a perspective of, you cut the head off a faction, but then you have all the people who were behind it, and they're still there, and it's really their ideas that count. Now, that said, there's a lot of kind of simplistic readings of this that say, for example, someone like Camille Desmoulins, who is one of the major figures in the Indulgent faction, who wrote in his newspaper about, again, wanting an end to the repression, unlimited freedom of the press, and an end to the war. There's kind of this notion that if I think that it was a mistake to execute him, that was something that was wrong to do, morally, tactically, whatever, that must mean that I think that he was right. And I actually don't. I think that, as I mentioned, trying to make peace under those circumstances, there's no way that the Republic would have survived. And many of the principles and reforms that the revolutionaries had been fighting for years would have gone out the window. And so I absolutely don't think that they could have just listened to Camille Desmoulins. I don't think he was the voice of reason. However, I think it was a mistake to execute him over it. You should be able to be wrong and not be executed.
Exactly.
So that's a very specific kind of small piece of what we kind of talk about as the terror today. More broadly, things like the law of suspects, which is actually a practice that goes further back than the decree of the 17th of September 1793, which is called the Law of Suspects. But it's basically the idea that as a safety measure, you can have a certain category of people that, you might want to keep an eye on and or put under house arrest or even imprison temporarily, at least until the war. And based on things that they may have said in the past, they're not, or categories that they might belong to. So if they are a family member of someone who's emigrated, for example, or if they are a family member of a refractory priest, so one of those priests who refused the oath to the nation and are by this point kind of associated with the counter-revolution, because again, in a situation of civil war, when you're telling people, if you're for the revolution, you're going to hell, that becomes a very political stance. And so in any case, so you have kind of this broader idea that, there's a certain category of people in the population that, they haven't done anything wrong and they're not being punished, but, as a precautionary measure, we are going to say they're called suspects, and we're going to potentially imprison a number of them. So you have that going on. You also have the executions following the various repression of pockets of civil war, and of course you have the Revolutionary Tribunal in Paris. And so that's kind of the broad strokes of what we kind of think of as the terror. Although to kind of put this in perspective, because a lot of people kind of get the impression that they wiped out like a majority of the population, or at least a majority of the aristocrats.
No.
Which is definitely very, very far from the case in terms of the
I've
total.
Heard is 40,000 altogether.
Yeah, so 40,000 is including like all of the repression of all of the different areas of civil war, with the exception of the Vendée, which you get into all kinds of problems calculating numbers there, because you have on the one hand people who are trying to extrapolate and kind of guess basically how many people may have been executed there. You also have people using like comparisons of populations, which really doesn't work, because sometimes somebody isn't in a given region anymore because they left, especially in a case of civil war. There are a lot of refugees. So in any case, so 40,000 is the common number that is still used, but that's based on Donald Greer's book from, I believe, the 1920s. So it's getting a little bit long in the tooth. I think somebody really needs to tackle that particular dossier and bring it up to date and see if those numbers still hold up. But in any case, what I realized when I was doing my doctoral research, because I researched a representative on mission, so one of those deputies that was sent to the provinces and the armies, is that in terms of proportions, even when we're talking about the suspects, and I by no means mean to defend this kind of measure, but we're looking at, even in like a really difficult departments like the Morbihan in Brittany, where they are dealing with regular uprisings, we're still dealing with somewhere between 0.5% and 1% of the population who is imprisoned as a suspect, which is, don't get me wrong, it's a lot, but when you put that in the perspective of, say, the total number of people who are in prison in the United States today, like, when there isn't a crisis situation, and you might say, well, that just goes to show, that there are major justice reforms that need to happen in the U.S. more than anything else. But in any case, it does kind of put it in some kind of perspective. In any case, where we really get this idea that there was the terror, as in like one person decided to declare themselves dictator and then chopped a bunch of heads off. That is a myth that was actually invented, as we talked about in the other podcast, that was actually invented at a very particular moment of the revolution. So you have this figure of Robbespierre, who is a very well known revolutionary, although I would not go so far as to say that he's, the incarnation of the revolution, as some people do. I think that that's kind of an absurd notion that like one person incarnates this like massive historical event that is a mass movement. But in any case, so he's a provincial lawyer. He is elected as a deputy from the Third Estate to the Estates General, and he is one of the biggest proponents of democracy, of universal suffrage, at least universal male suffrage, and the full realization of the principles of the Declaration of Rights under the Constituent Assembly. And then he gains this massive popularity from this. He's not the only one, of course, but certainly this is aided by the fact that he gives a lot of speeches. He really, puts himself out there, and he always refers back to these principles. So he becomes this very popular figure.
Right.
He was actually the one who said in the Constituent Assembly, members of this assembly should not be allowed to be a member of the next legislature. So that's basically the one piece of legislation that he actually manages to pass. So he can't be elected to the following legislature. So he has a newspaper. He's kind of, continuing to be involved in politics and debates under the Legislative Assembly, and then he's elected to the convention. And he remains this very, very popular figure. And of course, he's both loved and hated, as often happens with these kinds of cases. And he's ultimately one of the members of the Committee of Public Safety. He enters the committee at the end of July 1793. And so for many people, because he's the best of the members of the committee, even at the time, he becomes kind of the face of it, even though he's definitely not the person who signed the most, what they call arrêtés, the most decisions of the committee, nor is he even the main spokesperson, which is probably Prairial if we think about it. But in any case, he becomes kind of the face of the committee, and he doesn't have any more official power than anyone else, but he does have a lot of influence. And so a number of his colleagues notably become afraid of this influence, either because, for principled reasons, they're afraid of anybody having that kind of influence, or because they have been involved in either excessive use of the repressive apparatus. So basically, particularly in the provinces, there wasn't a lot of oversight immediately of the representatives on mission, and some of them abused their power. And so they're either involved in excessive use of force or in corruption, and they're afraid of Robespierre for that reason, because he has this reputation for incorruptibility. And so basically what ends up happening is that there is this group of deputies, other members of the Committee of Public Safety, members of the Committee of General Security, and then just other members of the convention, who don't really have anything in common except the fact that they all hate and or fear Robespierre. And so they ultimately get together, and they have him arrested, they have his friends arrested. And the interesting thing about this, I want to get this out of the way right away, is anytime you have any kind of narrative about these events, it's necessarily going to be a little bit wrong, at least most likely. And the reason for this is we don't really have any immediate sources on it that are not wildly biased, because in terms of, if you want to think about like the minutes of the assembly, for example, they were not recorded at the time. They were written down like a year later. So lots of time to kind of mess with the official records. And in terms of like pamphlet literature, that comes out after Robespierre has already been executed, which he will be following this. And so it's naturally very hostile to him and all of his friends and all of that. So you have kind of this situation where you have this major event that we're trying to reconstruct, but we don't have very good tools with which to do it. But the long story short, his friends are arrested. He's arrested. They're sent to separate prisons, but the prisons refuse to take them in. And, there's all kinds of debates over whether the prisons refused to take them in because they were friendly to them or because they were hostile to them, because you also have this idea that you can declare someone outside the law. So if you declare someone an outlaw, you don't need to give them a trial. You can just have them executed. So this is something that they came up with notably for some of the Repression leaders who, subsequent to the failure of the movements of revolt in the provinces, went on the run. And so this is something that they came up with to say, we already know that you led this movement of revolt. This is something where you can basically kill someone on sight. And so this was not very widely used, but it does become massively used with the Thermidor, and the reason it's called Thermidor is it's just the date in the revolutionary calendar, the 9th and 10th of Thermidor, so the end of July 1794. And basically, so these prisons refuse to take, and so they go to the which they kind of half-heartedly try to stage an insurrection. Again, our sources on this are not very good, so the question is, did the reason that the insurrection not work, was it just because they didn't have enough support, or was it because Robespierre and his friends were themselves hesitating over the legitimacy of attacking the convention? There's a great deal of debate about that, notably because our sources are not good. But in any case, ultimately, the convention sends troops to repress this uprising. Robespierre and his friends are rearrested, and he and his friends from the convention and the vast majority of the municipality or commune of Paris that took his side are all executed without trial over the next 3 days. And then basically, in the words of Bronislaw Baszko, and I really sincerely apologize for the mispronunciation of his name. I do not speak Polish at all. But in any case, so famously, he calls Thermidor an event in search of a meaning, basically. And that's very much true because, as I said, basically the only thing that people who were attacking Robespierre had in common was that for various reasons they didn't like Robespierre. So immediately you have this question of, what does this mean exactly? We've just executed one of the most popular revolutionaries, one of the most influential revolutionaries. What is the meaning of all of this? What can we kind of take from this? And there were definitely a number of people, including among the ones who were against Robespierre, who we call Thermidorians, who just didn't like Robespierre and kind of wanted things to continue going as they had been, and didn't necessarily even have that much in the way of political differences with Robespierre. They had a similar view of the Republic and how to establish it and so on. They just kind of feared his personal power. But you also have people who kind of view this as an opportunity to go back on kind of the more democratic and social reforms of the revolution, and to say, okay, this has been chaos, and our problem is not really, sure, we're going to frame it in terms of, bloodshed and all of this, but that's not really our problem. Our real problem is what they call the anarchy of the previous period, everybody deliberating at once. And, what we really need is stability and a republic of property owners. And this is a good opportunity to arrive at that point, because we can just kind of amalgamate everything that happened in the last year or so, say that it was a system of terror that Robespierre came up with all on his own, that the convention was just paralyzed in fear of him, and that we can now agree to move on from this whole period, and to say, the democratic constitution that we wrote, this doesn't happen immediately. I should mention it happens over several months, but this democratic constitution that we wrote, it goes too far. It's too democratic. We're scrapping it. We're going to limit voting rights again, make sure that, because, and I don't want to make it sound as if there's no sincerity at all in this kind of association between, repression and bloodshed and democracy, democratic participation, and the idea of a certain limited amount of property redistribution with, as I mentioned, inheritance law and also the sale of church and noble property in small lots, that kind of thing. So and also, public welfare programs starting to come in. So I think some of them they're sincere in their association between these two things. I don't think it's necessarily 100% a cynical manipulation, but certainly the idea that, everything was the idea of this one person and he forced us into it, and, we should just, bury this with him and we shouldn't have to face any kind of repercussions. That was definitely a cynical move on the part of people like Tallien and Fouché, who were the ones who really came up with this myth of, instead of this just being kind of an improvised response to foreign and civil war, that this was all, this one person's master plan, because he was not even actually a dictator. He was just aspiring to dictatorship, right? Mm-hmm. So, and this kind of becomes over time amalgamated into, he wasn't just aspiring to dictatorship, he definitely was a dictator. And, this is just, everything was fine until one day this one this one person decided I'm going to be dictator and I'm going to have everyone who disagrees with me executed. And that's really where that comes from is initially people like the representative on mission Tallien, who had some very shady dealings in Bordeaux, and was somebody who was involved in some of the excesses of the repression there, as a way for him to say, no, it wasn't me, it was this other guy. And then later to say, okay, well, we noticed that there were some more democratic reforms and some more kind of social reforms that happened in this period. And, we don't really want that. We want a revolution just, for us and our interests as property owners. And if we can associate those reforms with this idea of bloodshed and terror, then we can get rid of everything in one fell swoop. So basically, that's where you get the origins of this legend. But you can kind of ask yourself, why did it stick, right? Why is this still the way that we think about this period? Why do we think about it as like this extraordinarily violent and chaotic and horrible time period, as opposed to like all other periods in history? Like, for example, you can have a whole documentary on the court of Versailles, and Louis XIV had never once mentioned the Dragonnade, where he massacred Protestants, or his conquest of the Palatinate, or any of that. Like, that's considered off topic. But you can't mention any part of the revolution without people being like, but what about the terror?
Yeah.
So how did we get to this point? And honestly, I think that it's a narrative that was very helpful for certain people at certain points. It was a way of saying, and this up to, the present day, don't try to change society too radically, because look what happens. It always ends badly. It's kind of used as a scarecrow in that sense. And I think it also it kind of seems plausible to people from the perspective of, I can believe that somebody is too good to be true. They say that they have these ideals, and then they are really, just power hungry. Like, that's a more satisfying kind of story that kind of fits into our ideas of, there was this person who looked like they were someone like Robespierre, who looked like they were, positive in favor of democracy and everything, and they turned out to be a monster and got their comeuppance. It's very kind of like a Hollywood, sort of,
we like those narratives,
scenario. Yeah. And then again, as I mentioned, I think that people do have a lot of sympathy for the victims of the repression of this period, just because they're people whose stories we know. A lot of the time, as I mentioned, victims of repression, you don't know who they are. And it's also kind of paradoxically, I think, easier for people to kind of the upper echelons of this society, because I think it's hard for most people to relate to like an illiterate peasant. That's not like your life and your experience. And so even if, that's, most of our ancestors, and not, like the king and queen and aristocracy, I think that there's kind of that idea as well. And then, of course, I don't want to deny that there is a reality to this repression. I'm absolutely not saying, it was sunshine and roses and this was, the greatest period ever. But the idea being that there was good and bad in it. There were these major reforms that finally got through, some of which, are still kind of our horizon for us today, that we can kind of think of, these are things that got started that never have gotten finished, others of which were ahead of their time in the sense that they, ultimately came to fruition in the course of the 20th century. And, others of which, were actually durable from the beginning, like with the overthrow of the feudal system that doesn't come back.
Right, definitely. Yeah. You're an optimistic American. Even when you look at the French Revolution, you're still an optimistic American. You see the good in it. Yeah.
So, I mean, I guess I don't really see the point in saying, there's a good revolution and a bad revolution. This is a revolution that's a failure, and therefore there's nothing we can take from it except don't do that. Especially since we sometimes get into this idea of, you can either have good gradual reform or bad violent revolution. But in reality, it doesn't work that way. The revolutionaries started asking for reforms. And by the time you're like wrapped up in a revolution, you can't put it back in the bottle. It doesn't, it just doesn't work that way.
Napoleon put a few things back in the bottle, but not most of it. So, yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, in terms of by the time you get to Bonaparte, unfortunately, I've done the thing that everybody always does and kind of ignored the directoire. Sometime I'll have to prioritize talking about that, because that's also a very interesting period.
We could do that on a different episode, but because it is interesting. It is very interesting what led, because you think it's a step back, and then you think that with Napoleon III, when they finally gave the vote to every male in the country, who did they pick? Napoleon III. They picked a royalist. And so, French people are very ambivalent when it comes to these things. They say they want the thing, but maybe they don't entirely want that thing.
Yeah, no, it's definitely complicated, and the ways in which the countryside notably became much more conservative in the 19th century is a whole other can of worms.
Right. Anyway, fascinating stuff. Thank you so much for talking to me. It was really, really interesting. Have you written a book about this yet?
So you're very, very welcome to start with. I actually have my first book coming out, which is from my thesis, so on this representative omission, very shortly. So that is, unfortunately, in French. I've only written one article in English up to this point, actually, ironically.
We'd love to have a link to it so people can read it, because there are... Some of my listeners are really very big history geeks. So they might want to read all of that stuff, even in French. It's fascinating.
Oh yeah, for sure. I will definitely give you a link once that becomes available. It's going to be coming out next year with Maton, and so it's on Prairial La Marne, who is someone that no one has heard of, but as a case study. So it talks about a lot of the themes that we touched on today.
Right. All right. Well, thank you very much, Suzanne. And I wish you a great time in Italy, where you're going next. And thank you again for coming on the podcast, because every now and then it's good to get some real, meaty topic. One last question, though. If you wanted to see revolutionary things in Paris, the one place you would go?
Ooh, definitely the one place I would go in Paris would be the Musée Carnavalet, which actually recently reopened.
Yeah.
So you now have the opportunity to do that.
Excellent. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Au revoir.
Au revoir.
Again, I want to thank my patrons for supporting the show and giving back. Patrons get several exclusive rewards for doing so. You can see them at patreon.com/join us. Patreon. Thank you all for supporting the show. Some of you have been doing it for a long time, and I really appreciate that. And a shout out this week to new patrons, Sandra Hendricks and Jacob Owen. Thank you so much for becoming patrons and making this podcast possible. My thanks also to Anne Hubble and Sarah Lewis for sending in a one-time donation by using the green button on any page on joinusinfrance.com that says Tip Your Guide. Sarah wrote, "Merry Christmas. I wanted to tip my guide since I'm asking so many questions in the Facebook group." Thank you. You're very kind. Yeah, I enjoy answering the questions, but it's very kind of you to think about that. Let's go directly to the French expression of the week. Il pédale dans la semoule, or elle pédale dans la semoule, or je pédale dans la semoule. Let's break it down. Pédaler is to pedal, and la semoule is semolina. So imagine someone pedaling in a pool of semolina. This person is getting exhausted and going nowhere. In English, you'd probably say this person is going around in circles. But in French, we have to imagine this poor person pedaling in semolina, which I hope is not going to happen to any of us. This week in French news, well, now France used to be on level 3 as far as the U.S. Department of State was concerned. Level 3 was reconsider travel, and we're now on level 4, do not travel. Mind you, I'm told that all U.S. states are also on level 4, so they just don't want us to travel, which it makes sense. The way I look at it is, if you have a trip booked, come anyway, because vaccine coverage is still higher in France than in the US. Mask compliance is still higher. We have the health pass, even if not enough restaurants check it, in my opinion. Hospitals in France are not overwhelmed, except in a few towns where, you guessed it, vaccination rates are lower than average. Overall conditions are not more dangerous in France than in the US, even though we are experiencing a fifth wave of COVID. It's still the Delta variant that is sending unvaccinated people to the hospital. Time will tell what the Omicron variant will do. And to see the granular detail of how things are evolving in France, go to covidtracker.fr. Will this change anything on the ground in France? No. France is not going to shut down because the State Department raised the level to 4. Nightclubs have been mandated to close until after the holidays, but that's the only thing that's closing. There are new rules and testing regimens for school kids, but that shouldn't change your travel plans. So restaurants, cafes, hotels, museums, they're all open, and that's not going to change. I mean, never say never. This is a pandemic, but I am confident that President Macron and his government want to keep things as open as possible, given the fact that we have plenty of vaccine. The number of shots administered week to week in France is up by 82%, and more vaccination centers are opening every day. So if you've booked already, just come. But if you have not booked anything, just wait for now. Let the holidays pass and revisit later. My family and I, we've booked a trip to the US to spend Christmas with family, and I'm really, really looking forward to it. I don't look forward to the flight, but I never look forward to the flight. But, that's really the only part that worries me. We bought the best travel insurance that money can buy. We're well prepared. We're triple vaxxed. We'll be careful, but we're going. It's a risk, but it's a managed risk. So the next COVID update from me will be on January 9th, but the podcast will continue to come out every Sunday during the holidays because, I'm very lucky. I have Elise and various guests who love talking about France, and they come on the podcast, and so I can release those, but you'll have to wait until January 9th for more time-specific information. And for the end of this year, I would like to ask you to do me a big favor. I would love to pick your brain as to what I can do to make the podcast more interesting. Are there things that I'm doing too much, things I'm not doing enough? I don't ask for a lot of feedback. I mean, I do get feedback from people, but usually people tell me, oh, I love it. Thank you so much. Whatever. It's very vague like that. If you have specific recommendations, I would love to read them. Send your feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. And I would love to talk to you about this and pick your brains about this. Because I'm sure if you listen to this podcast, you probably listen to other podcasts and you probably have some good ideas for me. Show notes for this episode are on joinusinfrance.com/367, where you can see a recap of what we've discussed, and it was a lot of history this week. And if you enjoy the show, introduce a friend to the podcast and tell them how you listen and why you listen and what you enjoy about this podcast. Next week on the podcast, an episode about how to best enjoy the Christmas season in Paris. These are the places that are incontournable in Paris. Incontournable meaning it's a must see. You must go there. That's where the stuff happens. And so we'll list them all in next week's episode. And maybe you're not coming to Paris this year for Christmas, but hopefully you'll do it someday. Send questions or feedback to Annie@joinusinfrance.com. Thank you so much for listening, and I hope you join me next time so we can look around France together. Au revoir. The Join Us in France Travel Podcast is written, hosted, and produced by Annie Sargent and copyright 2021 by Addicted to France. It is released under a Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, No Derivatives license.